The SpaceX Starship will carry humans to Mars, where there is no gravity. But how is SpaceX going to produce artificial Starship gravity? This is an eye-catching look at the crazy approach SpaceX will employ to create an artificial gravity on the Starship. Gravity is what enables you to get from your house to the store without floating in space. Gravity keeps everything down. It is quite simple because it's quite natural, and we take it for granted. When you go to space, the narrative is different since there is no gravity. Astronauts live in quite a different setting, and that is because of the lack of gravity. When they're in space, they feel like there is no gravity, and this shows how astronauts float around. This is significant because astronauts have a lot of time to adapt to zero gravity because they leave the planet. Starship lies at the core of the idea of Elon Musk to turn people into a multi-planet species. But as big and flexible the Starship is, the irritating presence of no gravity is not easily dealt with. SpaceX must discover a means to inject gravity in the Starship artificially, as visitors to Mars are scheduled to stay up to 9 months on the road. The muscles are affected quite a lot. You lose strength since you don't use them as much because of zero gravity. Even continuous training is not sufficient to offset your muscular impact. So while you're happy in the ship, when you land on Mars, you won't be able to lift an arm. We've seen a lot of movies with examples of artificial gravity, but SpaceX is going to inform you that reality is far from that, with a centric force being the most practical means of generating artificial gravity. So how does that work? Well, when you spin something, the more you spin, the more you notice that the object is being moved away from the spin center. So if the ship is spinning, what would happen to everyone inside? Well, they will presumably be pushed away from the center of the Starship to the walls. The centrifugal force acts constantly, substituting gravity gently. But this needs a lot of care to ensure that a force does not surpass the force of gravity for the passengers. Otherwise, it's gonna be quite a mess. However, SpaceX will not be the first firm to take this into consideration, as the most common way to the application of gravity when thinking about circumstances in which humans spend a long period in space, SpaceX can also use a linear acceleration approach to try to produce gravity, which includes the use of the Starship Raptors to continually speed up in a straight path. The result is to put anything within the Starship in the opposite direction. The difficulty here is that the motors must always operate and continue to accelerate. When the motors are switched off, the only practical motors that can propel a vessel quickly enough to achieve Earth's gravity-like speeds require chemical reaction rockets. In the 1950s, NASA started to entertain the idea of a rotating space station, but it had never constructed one. And this is only because artificial gravity was not important for NASA. So it would have been pointless to devote its resources to the only other place visited by humans, which is the Moon. The International Space Station, however, since NASA believes the lab is quite important, as the microgravity setting of the station is the home of many previous and recent experiments. While much of the work we know about has made it safe for the Starship itself to fly and land, we can't say for sure that the work of artificial gravity progresses, or is it postponed for later. Many fans of the company and other space enthusiasts have come up with some interesting anti-zero gravity concepts. SpaceX Vision, for instance, has developed an amazing picture on how the Starship may be rotated to produce artificial gravity. In its idea, the Starship breaks from the center and these arms start spinning around the spaceship. And then it begins to use the extended two cabin arms at each end, creating a centrifuge force needed to mimic gravity in those cabins. This can be a great way to introduce artificial gravity zones into the Starship itself while it's in orbit. The artificial gravity can be dialed up with a simple increase in speed. That is to say, the production of artificial gravity is not a stroll in the park. Also, the amount of centrifugal force you experience during your spin depends on your distance from the center of your spin. Given the relatively small proportions of the Starship in comparison to, say, an Earth, you will definitely feel the force throughout your body, and especially on your legs, and that would make the movements of the body quite difficult. When the Starship is spinning, you must consider the large amount you need for propellants and dreadfully limit supply out. The concern here is that if you only spin a section of the Starship, it will create a host of other issues, such as ensuring that the Starship stays balanced. The total weight of the Starship will vary considerably based on the fact that SpaceX has a lot to do to provide gravity in the Starship itself. As a cargo transporter or as a human carrier, any intended spinning on the spacecraft will have to take into account that it is certainly a challenge to SpaceX. The concept here goes back to over a century. Since then, many variations of this idea have been proposed for space stations and habitats, such as the Von Braun wheel and the O'Neill cylinder, and the Stanford torus. Some concepts are even being considered for development, such as NASA's Nautilus X space station, or the Gateway Foundation's proposal for a commercial space station. After some research, small stars arrived at the idea for the GLS. The GLS is basically a hub ship. Like for example the hub of a wheel, where the payload bay is filled with a truss that unfolds and deploys, thus serving as the wheel spokes. It would be positioned between two passenger starships and would link up with them during the 6-month-long journey to Mars. Once linked up, the passenger ship would swivel around to reorient themselves and fire their thrusters to impart momentum to the wheel. Once enough velocity was generated to simulate Earth normal gravity, the passenger ships would reorient themselves again to face inward towards the hub ship. For the remainder of the journey, those aboard the Starship would experience the sensation of being pulled down thanks to the centripetal force created by the rotation of the wheel. Currently, a great deal is known about the long-term effects of exposure to microgravity, thanks in large part to research conducted by astronauts aboard the International Space Station. These include muscle loss, bone density loss, diminished organ function, eyesight, changes of cardiovascular strength, and even genetic changes. These are things that astronauts can certainly attest to. After spending a year in space thanks to NASA's twin study, one of the twins found that readjusting to life back on Earth is quite agonizing. In addition to detailing the system, small stars also performed the necessary calculations to determine the structure of the truss, and also the necessary velocity to simulate Earth normal gravity. They determined that a rotation velocity of 31 meters per second would work for a system that measures around 100 meters in radius, providing the feeling of 1G and making roughly 3 rotations per minute. Currently, Small Stars is on the second iteration of its proposal, which includes updated calculations on the rotation, and also a new truss shape. And also the introduction of cables to reinforce the tensile strength of the truss. They plan to release a third version in the near future that would feature the calculations about the loads and also an animation of the deployment and function of the truss. As you can see, this presents a number of challenges, some of which are prolonged exposure to radiation and microgravity. But we already know how to protect crews from radiation, but gravity remains a bit of a stumbling block. Thank you guys for watching this video. I hope you learned something today. If you did, make sure to leave a big thumbs up to this video, and also don't forget to turn on notifications for more informative content in the future.